My daughter was born deaf, severely disabled, 2 months premature, and it would take me years to find out why. Daria couldn't hear me. She couldn't hear anything, not music, not her own name, not the particular sound a mother makes when she's trying to soothe a baby who won't stop crying because the whole world arrived broken and there was no way to explain that to her. The doctors use careful language at first, the kind of language doctors use when they don't want to say the word permanent out loud. Eventually, somebody did say it. Lifelong institutional care. I was 23 years old, married 4 years, one of the most photographed faces in America, and none of that meant anything in the room where they told me what was actually wrong with my child. Let me tell you how I got to that room, because the story doesn't start there. It starts in Brooklyn, in a family with more money than warmth, in a girl who wasn't supposed to want any of this in the first place. I was born in Brooklyn in November of 1920, the middle child of 3, to a father who sold insurance and turned out to be remarkably good at it. By the time I was 5, Howard Tierney had made enough money to move us out to Greens Farms, Connecticut, where he started buying up the surrounding land like a man building himself a small kingdom out of real estate deeds. He was not a patient man. He was not, by most accounts including my own, an easy one. But he understood money, and money in our house meant the right schools, the right writing lessons, the right kind of silence at dinner about anything that embarrassed the family name. My mother, Belle, had been a physical education instructor before she married him, which should tell you something about her. She was not the fainting type, not soft in the way Connecticut mothers were supposed to be soft. Between the two of them, I inherited a strange combination: my father's appetite for control and my mother's physical confidence. And neither one of them had any interest whatsoever in their daughter becoming an actress. I was sent to St. Margaret's School in Waterbury, then the Umpqua School, an education engineered to produce a proper young woman who married well, not a girl who stood under stage lights for a living. I made my society debut in September 1938. The white dress, the receiving line, the entire choreographed ritual of being presented to a world that had already decided exactly what I was for before I'd said a single word about what I wanted. I lasted about a month being bored out of my mind by it. While my father was quietly setting up something called the Bell Tier Corporation to manage my future earnings, before I had earned a single dollar to manage, I was sneaking off to acting classes down in Greenwich Village, finding a director named George Abbott who took me more seriously in 6 weeks than my parents had in 18 years. It started, the way the good stories usually do, almost by accident. My family took a vacation out to Hollywood in the summer of 1938, the standard pilgrimage wealthy East Coast families made. And through a family friend, we got onto the set of The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex while it was shooting. I was standing around in my good traveling clothes, trying to look like I belonged somewhere I clearly didn't, when the director, Anatole Litvak, looked over at me and said, flatly, that I should be in pictures. I had a screen test the very next day. Warner Brothers offered me a contract on the spot. My parents took one look at the salary they were offering an unknown 18-year-old and said, absolutely not. The money wasn't worth the family embarrassment of a Tierney name on a studio payroll next to chorus girls and stuntmen. I went home to Connecticut and finished out my debutante season exactly as scheduled, smiling at exactly the right people as though nothing at all had happened out there. But something had happened. I'd felt, for about 90 seconds in front of that camera, what it was like to have someone actually look at me instead of through me, and that feeling did not go away just because my father said no. I kept going to the acting classes anyway. George Abbott eventually put me in a real Broadway production, small parts but real ones, and by 1940, 20th Century Fox came calling with an offer serious enough that the money question finally got answered the way I wanted it answered instead of the way my father wanted it answered. I signed with Fox that year. My film debut came almost immediately, age 20, in a Fritz Lang Western called The Return of Frank James, and for the first time in my entire life, nobody was asking Howard Tierney's permission for anything I did. Not for this. I eloped with Oleg Cassini in June of 1941. And I want to be honest, part of the appeal was exactly how furious it would make my parents. He was 28, Paris-born, son of a Russian father and an Italian countess, working as a costume designer in Paramount's wardrobe department, which made him, in my mother's specific vocabulary, essentially staff. We flew to Las Vegas and got married in a civil ceremony with almost no warning to anyone, and I signed the marriage certificate as Gene Eliza Taylor Tierney, adding a name nobody had asked me to add, just because for one single day I could write down whatever I wanted without anybody's permission. Paramount fired Oleg almost immediately afterward. The studio system in those years did not appreciate its wardrobe employees marrying its rising young contract players without the appropriate paperwork and approvals. And he paid for our romance with his job before the honeymoon was even finished. My parents were apoplectic in the specific way only old money can be apoplectic, all clenched jaws and silence at family gatherings. The Hollywood trade papers had a wonderful week picking the whole thing apart. None of it touched me at the time. I was 20 years old, and I had finally done one completely, stubbornly unsupervised thing with my own life. We were happy in the chaotic way two strong-willed 20-somethings are happy. Constant fighting followed by constant reconciling. Building something that photographed beautifully and felt considerably messier up close than any of the magazine spreads ever let on. Oleg dressed me for the screen for years afterward. The film credits actually reading, "Costumes for Miss Tierney, executed by Oleg Cassini," a strange little public monument to a marriage that was already, underneath the glamour, more fragile than either one of us wanted to say out loud to anybody, including ourselves. Otto Preminger almost didn't cast me, and the embarrassing truth is, I nearly talked him out of it myself. I read the script for Laura and had genuine doubts about whether I belonged in it. The role required a kind of static, painterly beauty, the sort of face that could hang on a wall and be obsessed over for an entire film before the audience ever saw it move. And I actually told people at the time that I thought it was a part for Hedy Lamarr, somebody whose beauty just existed perfectly without needing to do anything at all. Jennifer Jones had already turned the role down, reportedly at her husband David Selznick's insistence. I got it almost by elimination, the last name left on a list that had started somewhere else entirely. The structure of that picture is the strange part. Laura barely appears for the first third of the film. She's a presumed murder victim, a portrait hanging over a detective's shoulder, a woman everyone in the story is obsessed with before the audience ever hears her speak a word. Dana Andrews spends almost half the runtime falling in love with a painting. When I finally walk through that apartment door alive, the entire audience has already decided who I am before I've said a single line, which, when I think about it now, was basically a documentary about my actual life dressed up as a murder mystery. The film came out in 1944, and it changed everything for me. Daryl Zanuck, who ran the whole studio, started telling reporters that I was, in his words, unquestionably the most beautiful woman in movie history, which is a genuinely strange sentence to have printed about yourself in newspapers across the country, flattering and suffocating in the exact same breath. Laura made me a star Fox could finally attach a real dollar figure to. It also meant that for the rest of my career, No matter what else I did, I was going to be measured against a painting of a dead girl, forever. The Hollywood Canteen ran every single night of the war on volunteer stars, dancing with enlisted men who were shipping out within days, sometimes hours, to places in the Pacific Theater that none of us back home could properly imagine. I went whenever my schedule allowed it. It mattered to me differently than the studio's other publicity demands, because this wasn't about selling movie tickets. This was about a boy who might be dead by Christmas getting to dance, just once, with somebody whose face he'd watched on a screen back home before any of this started. I was pregnant that fall, expecting my first child with Oleg, and I kept showing up anyway, because nobody specifically told pregnant actresses to stay away from the canteen, and because I genuinely wanted to be there regardless. The room was packed every single night, hundreds of uniforms crowded together, a rotating handful of actresses working the floor in shifts, a radio playing whatever was popular that month, while everybody in the building quietly tried not to think too hard about who in that room wasn't coming back. A young woman approached me on one of those nights, a fan, gushing the particular way fans gushed when they finally got close enough, and she shook my hand warmly before disappearing back into a sea of identical uniforms. I genuinely did not think about her again, not once, not for years. There were 100 handshakes that same night, and 100 more the next time I went, faces blurring together into a single grateful crowd. And there was absolutely nothing about that one specific moment that registered as different from any of the others. I had no possible way of knowing it was the only handshake out of thousands that actually mattered. My daughter Daria was born 2 months premature in October of 1943, deaf, severely disabled in ways the doctors at that time genuinely struggled to explain to either of us. They eventually arrived at a diagnosis: congenital rubella syndrome, the specific medical catastrophe that happens when German measles crosses the placenta during a pregnancy's first trimester, attacking the developing hearing, the developing brain, the entire architecture of a child who would otherwise, under any other circumstances, have been completely healthy. We named her Antoinette Daria Cassini. Oleg was still finishing his military service at Fort Riley in Kansas when she was born, and the news that should have been the proudest moment of his entire deployment arrived instead as the start of a grief neither one of us had a single piece of preparation for. The doctors told us, as gently as men in that era knew how to deliver this kind of information, that she would need institutional care for the rest of her life, that there was no treatment available, no recovery to expect, no version of this where Daria grew up the ordinary way her little sister Tina eventually would 5 years later. I did not know yet what had actually caused it. I assumed, the way you assume things when you're 23 years old and devastated and desperately looking for somewhere to put an unbearable amount of blame, that I had done something wrong myself. Worked too many hours, danced too late at the canteen during a pregnancy I should have guarded more carefully, eaten the wrong thing, prayed the wrong way. I carried that completely misplaced private guilt for years, with no name attached to it, no actual cause, just a mother's reflexive certainty that somehow, somewhere, this had to be her own fault. Years later, a woman came up to me at a party, somewhere inside that endless circuit of Hollywood evenings that all start blurring together once you've attended enough of them to lose count. She told me, with what I can only honestly describe as pride in her voice, that she had been at the Hollywood Canteen the same year I was pregnant. She told me she'd had German measles at the time. She told me she had broken quarantine specifically to come meet me because she simply didn't want to miss her one chance. She told the whole story like it was charming, like sneaking out of medical isolation to shake a movie star's hand was exactly the kind of harmless, youthful daring you'd happily repeat to your own grandchildren one day. She had no apparent idea, or she had quietly decided not to know, what rubella actually does to an unborn child during the first trimester of a pregnancy. She stood there describing in complete innocence the precise mechanism of the single worst thing that had ever happened to me and to my family. I excused myself from that conversation as gracefully as 2 decades of studio training had taught me to excuse myself from absolutely anything. I genuinely do not remember the specific words I used. I remember finding somewhere quiet and sitting very still for a long stretch of time, finally doing the arithmetic I had never before had the actual information to complete. The entire timeline suddenly whole. All that misplaced guilt I'd been hauling around for years, abruptly reattached to a real stranger's real carelessness instead of my own imagined failures as a mother. By 1953, my marriage to Oleg had collapsed for good, the second and final time. And whatever fragile architecture I'd been holding together through the first divorce and the brief reconciliation finally gave out completely. I was cast in Mogambo that same year, a real opportunity, John Ford directing, a script that genuinely could have meant something significant for my career at exactly the moment I needed something, anything, to go right for me. I couldn't finish the production. I dropped out partway through, unable to properly concentrate, unable to reliably remember my own lines, unable to manage the basic mechanics of a job I had spent 15 years carefully mastering. They replaced me with Grace Kelly, who earned an Academy Award nomination out of the exact role I couldn't manage to hold on to. I'll be honest, that particular detail used to sting worse than almost anything else in this entire story. Watching another actress's career launch from the precise spot mine had just publicly collapsed. It doesn't sting the same way anymore. Grace genuinely earned that nomination on her own merits. I simply wasn't capable of standing in that jungle that particular year, and no amount of professional pride changes what was actually clinically true about my condition at the time. 2 years after that, I was cast opposite Humphrey Bogart in The Left Hand of God, and the exact same thing happened again, only worse this time. I couldn't hold on to my lines. Bogey quietly fed them to me between takes, the way you discreetly help a friend who was visibly drowning in front of everyone. And privately, away from the crew, he told me to get real help. His own sister Pat had struggled with serious mental illness for years, so he recognized what he was watching faster than I did myself. And he was kinder about the whole situation than almost anyone else in that industry ever bothered to be with me. I checked into Harkness Pavilion in New York first, then later the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut, a mental sanitarium where I ended up spending the better part of a year and a half of my life. The standard treatment in that era for what doctors then called manic depression was electroshock therapy. 27 separate sessions by the time the whole course was finally finished, each one administered with the confident, clinical certainty of the time that this was simply how you repaired a mind that had broken down. I actually ran from that facility once. I got caught fairly quickly and brought straight back, which sounds dramatic written down on paper, but felt in the actual moment like the only rational response available to a treatment that didn't feel anything like healing, so much as it felt like a kind of careful erasure. After Hartford, I spent another 8 months at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, where part of my therapy program involved working completely anonymously as a clerk in a local dress shop, folding sweaters for ordinary customers who had absolutely no idea the quiet young woman ringing up their purchases had recently been one of the most photographed faces in all of America. I came back to Hollywood properly in 1957, 4 full years after Mogambo, and I discovered that Fox had kept my contract salary running the entire time I'd been away, which I learned later was considerably less generosity on their part than simple insurance against losing a valuable asset entirely. I walked the old studio lots again at 37 years old, and every executive, every actor, every set carpenter who recognized me came hurrying over to shake my hand and welcome me home. And I told anyone who actually asked, with the easy directness I'd finally earned the hard way, exactly where I'd been and exactly what had happened to me there. I made a genuine comeback in 1962 with advise and consent, working again with Otto Preminger almost 20 years after Laura. And the critics at the time said my acting was every bit as sharp as it had ever been. The industry's demand for me wasn't quite what it used to be. Work moves on whether or not you've actually recovered, but the performance itself was real, and I remain proud of it to this day. My final feature film was The Pleasure Seekers in 1964, slapping a young Carol Lindley across the face and calling her a tramp on screen, about as far from the painting on the wall in Laura as a career arc could possibly travel. And not long after that, I retired comfortably into a second marriage with a Texas oilman named Howard Lee, who gave me 20 genuinely peaceful years in Houston that I had absolutely earned the hard way by then. Daria spent her entire life in institutional care, exactly as the doctors had predicted the year she was born. Oleg and I built and maintained that arrangement together for decades, even long after our marriage had permanently ended, and our divorce settlement specifically guaranteed that half of his estate would go to our daughters when he eventually passed. One small, permanent fact of genuine love that outlasted absolutely everything else between us. I eventually wrote the whole story down, the breakdowns and the shock treatments and the canteen and the woman at that party, in a memoir called Self-Portrait, published in 1979, because I had decided somewhere in my 50s that the truth would be considerably more useful to other people than my continued silence had ever managed to be. I was interviewed on French television once, fairly late in my life, and the interviewer asked whether I still enjoyed watching myself on screen. I told her honestly, not really, because some stubborn part of me still expected to look exactly the way I'd looked back in 1944, and every single morning in the mirror still came as a small, genuinely honest surprise. That's about as close as I can get to the actual truth of this whole story. I built an entire career on being called the most beautiful woman in pictures, lost years of my life to one stranger's carelessness and a disease nobody had bothered to warn either of us about, and came out the other side still surprised, every morning without fail, by exactly how much a single person can actually survive and keep going anyway. She knew me. That's what mattered.